Hi, I'm Jim Thunder, and along with my good friends Peter and Adam, we're happy to present these Overdue Diligence videos. One thing that I really wanted to do in making these videos was to give a video that answers the question of how did we get here? Why is there so much economic disparity between Canada's Indigenous peoples and the rest of us? I'm going to explain our history in 4 stages. The first stage, I'm going to call it the pre-contact stage. So for this stage, you can imagine Europe being filled with nations that are slightly different. They have different economies, they have different cultures, they have different government structures, and so on. And in Turtle Island, you have much the same thing. You have different nations that have different cultures, different economies, different political structures. But nobody from either side really knows about the other because we're separated by an ocean. So that's where stage 2 comes in. Stage 2 is when your first European nation makes contact with the first Indigenous nation. And here's where things start to get exciting because these nations begin to work together. The relationship is in the beginning very respectful, mutually respectful. And it's in this stage where the economies begin to merge. And we see things like the fur trade. The fur trade was when Indigenous nations would trade things like furs and fur products for things like kettles, knives, guns, blankets, European goods. This was when the formation of North America's oldest company took place, the Hudson's Bay Company. So it was a period of nation-to-nation agreement, mutual respect, and working together that was fantastic, with maybe the small exception of the Hudson's Bay Company being granted the entire Hudson's Bay watershed area without any thought to the people that are actually living there. This stage ended when Canada became a nation. So why did it change at that point? Well, up until this time, Canada began to realize that the fur trade is dying off. The future of their economy is going to be based on things like timber, farmland, gold, and eventually oil. So they have the opportunity to look and to say, hey, we can continue in this respectful nation-to-nation relationship, or they could choose assimilation. The reason why they chose assimilation is because they wanted to be the only nation in this land. They wanted to absorb all the other nations into itself so that they would have nobody to negotiate with in terms of how the lands and resources are being used except for Canada itself. The first thing that Canada did was it purchased the vast Hudson Bay watershed area from not the people who lived in that area, but from the Hudson's Bay Company. So of course, this enraged the peoples who lived there, including the Métis people. So the Métis people were people who came from European descent as well as Indigenous descent. When the fur trade was happening, this new nation was born. And from this nation, there arose a leader named Louis Riel. And Louis Riel fought for the cause of the Métis people, which ultimately resulted in his execution and the fight for Métis rights living on. Canada then began to acquire more land through the numbered treaties. So the numbered treaties promised a number of things to Indigenous nations, including support and protection for traditional hunting and fishing rights, agricultural support, educational support, and a number of annual promises that are meant to be carried on for as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow. So the problem with this is that Canada shot through these first 7 treaties really fast. Shot through all of them really fast, actually. And there was a number of complications in terms of, did both sides really understand what each treaty meant? Did they understand what was promised? Were all the verbal promises written down? One of the biggest misunderstandings is the fact that Indigenous people never really understood that they never understood the treaties to mean that they were giving up the land, that there was an absolute surrender. But at the end of the day, Canada had what it wanted. It had access to all the lands from sea to sea, and it had the lands north of the Canada-US border. While the treaties were negotiated and signed, Canada put together the Indian Act. Now, to describe what this complex act is in the most simple way, I'll say it this way. The Indian Act was when Canadian leaders thought to themselves, we don't want to deal with a number of Indigenous nations and to recognize them as nations. Instead, let's put them together into one category. Let's lump all the different nations into one category and let's call it status. And let's make status so unbearably difficult for them to live in that Indigenous people will abandon status in order to go live in the general Canadian population. Understanding the Indian Act is helpful to understand why, for example, there aren't many Indigenous farmers around. A lot of people might say that it's because Indigenous people are lazy or they're not organized, when in fact, they were very organized and they were doing very well. But because of the Indian Act, we have policies like severalty, peasant farming, the pass system, and the permit system, which made things impossible for Indigenous nations to move forward in agriculture. But by far the biggest reason for the economic disparity that we see today from the Indian Act was the Indian residential school system. Imagine that a non-Indigenous person steps into an Indigenous community, steps into an Indigenous family, and apprehends an innocent child, takes the child out of the community, out of the culture that they were raised in, and placed in a class where they were repeatedly taught again and again that their culture, their beliefs, their way of life, their values, the way that they see the world is less than. It's ridiculous and it's evil. And this didn't happen just to one child or two. This happened to over 150,000 children. The children who went to these schools experienced severe trauma from mental, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Many, many children died, to the point that the Canadian government literally stopped counting them. And this dark chapter of Canada's history expanded almost as long as Canada itself has existed. Where do we move from here? And that's where the fourth stage of reconciliation comes in. So I'd love to talk about how this fourth stage got kicked off. I'd love to talk about the white paper and the red paper, how the white paper caused Indigenous nations from across the nation to come together to speak against it with one voice. I'd love to talk about the Ochre crisis and how this got international attention that led to a chain of events that led to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People being mandated to try to solve the question, to try to understand how Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations had gotten so bad. But instead, I'm going to jump right in and talk about reconciliation. So what is reconciliation? What does that mean? Reconciliation is when two parties look at the past, acknowledge what has happened, and redefine their relationships in a way that is mutually beneficial and respectful, in a way that the two can move forward together into the future. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was formed in response to residential schools. It was to help us to figure out how to move forward in reconciliation. And they've given us 94 calls to action. These calls to action are meant for all of us. There are some that are meant for church groups, some for the media, some for educators, and some for the business community. Among them include the recommendation to acknowledge the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which says, among other things, that in order for any type of economic development to take place on Indigenous lands, it has to take place only with free, prior, and informed consent of the Indigenous nation itself. Winnipeg's Indigenous Accord is an example of how the business community in our province is responding to the calls to action. This accord is a living document that invites businesses from all over Manitoba to come together and to talk about and report on what they are doing specifically in response to these calls to action. It's a fantastic way for us to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation. If we don't understand our history, if we don't understand the treaties, then we can't meaningfully participate in this conversation around reconciliation. And we can't participate in the great opportunities that are happening in our province with Indigenous people and Indigenous business communities. So what I want to do is I want to leave you with a challenge and an encouragement to look deeper into the things that I've touched on in this video and to ask yourself, what am I going to do in this process of reconciliation?